This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. It's estimated that there are at least 100,000, possibly 200,000, or maybe it's 300,000 books written about Napoleon Bonaparte, depending on where you're Googling. In any case, more than one person can read. I would think it's unlikely you could even read the list. As for movies, well, according to respected film historian and former director of the Swiss Cinémathèque, Hervé Dumont, Napoleon has inspired some 1,000 related films and television programs. The latest cinematic effort came from famed director Ridley Scott. That film, simply called Napoleon, was released in November of 2023 and featured the expected huge battle scenes along with other stages of the emperor's life. One of the film's consultants is prominent historian Michael Broers, whose 3-volume biography of Napoleon is among those hundreds of thousands of published materials. Michael, who is a professor of Western European history at Oxford and has published numerous other books about Napoleon and his era, joins us today. Michael, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to discuss this wildly notorious ruler.
My pleasure entirely, Ernst. This is my cat, Woody, by the way.
How are you doing, Woody?
Protocols, I'm afraid.
As expected, I suppose Ridley Scott's film has taken some heat from historians, especially French historians, many of whom have accused it as not being historically accurate. Luckily, you as a consultant have had Ridley Scott to run some interference for you, because from some of the interviews that I've heard, he hasn't taken kindly to that criticism. Although I will say his responses have been quite entertaining. But what's your view of how the film has been received?
Oh, the film among historians, the film's reception among historians has been very hostile. I think sometimes people forget that we were trying to make a movie. We were trying that you can only cover so much in the time frame we had. A lot of their criticisms will be answered in the director's cut, which I believe will be released shortly, where an awful lot of things that they had a go at us for were addressed, but again, addressed in a way that's audience friendly. Although I have to say, as far as I can gauge it, the reception of the viewing public has been very, very positive. It seems to have gone down, very well, because it is a spectacle. It is fun. We weren't trying to do high art. And it is actually, I have to say this, having read a lot of historians' attacks on us, not the French. The French have their own axe to grind. Napoleon is their property. Napoleon is their property. And they wouldn't have liked anybody's film if it wasn't French. But one thing I have to say, having read a lot of historians' criticisms of us, and some of it actually is justified, but you have to work within certain constraints of entertainment and time. But in the process of criticizing us, they make far more serious errors themselves than anything we did.
In what ways?
Well, I won't name any names, but there was one person, British historian, and he's not a Napoleonic expert, must be said. He's a television pundit type historian, but it didn't stop him having a go. And he then corrected us and gave us the facts about Napoleon's early life, which were completely wrong. Everything he said was wrong. When it's intimated in the film that Napoleon did not come from a wealthy background. He didn't come from inside the elite, which is true. He turned around by saying, "Oh no, his father under the French was the second most important person on the island." Well, he wasn't. He'd been in cahoots with a rebel leader, Napoleon, and had an awful lot of bridge building to build with the French. He was a very successful attorney in Ajaccio, his hometown. Napoleon's mother belonged to a pretty wealthy and distinguished family from Bastia, and they always thought she'd married below herself. I mean, I could go on and on. Another historian, who I think very well in many ways, after having a go at the factual anomalies in the film, he was by and large right, went on to cite the famous snowball fight when he's at school, which of course
Yes.
is itself completely erroneous and never happened. It's a piece of myth making, like George Washington cutting down the cherry trees, Napoleon's equivalent of that. And cited the source as a memoir of someone who knew Napoleon. Yes, he did. But every Napoleonic scholar knows that those memoirs, written by a guy called Napoleon, with whom Napoleon was at school, are among the most dubious of the period. You'd never take them seriously. I think there's one bit of those memoirs you can, because it's where he's trying to justify himself after he got in trouble with Napoleon. But he goes ahead and blindly writes the memoirs, or rather a ghostwriter wrote them, and about the whole regime and everything. He himself was nowhere near Paris. He spent most of the period in semi-exile in Hamburg. But you don't take it seriously. But this is held up, as a piece of fact to the reader, to the uninformed reader. So you have to smile at times like that. I mean, you really.
Regardless of the critics, the film accomplished its objective of being entertaining. There's no question about that. Watching some of the battle scenes is just amazing. Now, I've read your most recent volume of the history of Napoleon. I haven't had a chance to read the first two volumes. The third book is called Napoleon, the Decline and Fall of an Empire, 1811 to 1821, which I'll use as the starting point for this conversation. After all, there are so many aspects of Napoleon and his era that I don't believe we could give proper consideration to all of those in one discussion. When you begin Decline and Fall, Napoleon seems to be at the peak of his powers, although he's been handed some defeats in Spain. But in the following few years, everything changes very quickly. Could you set the scene for us?
Yeah. I was very much inspired writing that volume by Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I've loved Gibbon since I was a boy, and very much at the back of my mind. Now, obviously, Gibbon's dealing with half a millennium. I'm dealing with a decade. But when I opened Gibbon when I was a lad, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and I thought, why does he start with Augustus? Surely that's when the Roman Empire is at its zenith. But he makes his point that really the seeds of disaster are often sown at the time when the empire is at its apogee. It's just that nobody sees it. Nobody wants to admit it. That's where I began from. Everybody thinks that, this is Napoleon. He thinks, everyone at the time thinks in some ways, this is Napoleon's set. He's remarried. He's finally got the son and heir he's longed for, which hopefully is going to solidify the situation. He seems to have come to an understanding, an entente with the Russians, who are the only major threat left to him, with Tsar. Seems to have a working arrangement with him. And his continental blockade against Britain seems to be working. The British economy is going through a very rough period. Even Spain, actually. I was talking to my old pal Charles Estelle not that long ago, and it's that point, 1810 to sort of 1812. If you look hard at Spain, we were both saying the French are starting to win. That they're beginning to get the upper hand. So it does look great, and it's like if you go back to Gibbon and you look at Augustus, you look at the Silver Age of Rome, everything is looking really good. But the problems are already there. The British economy is not going to continue to collapse. It's not collapsing for the reasons Napoleon thinks it is. It's not to do with the blockade. The blockade is stretching the military resources of the empire and the administrative resources way beyond their capacity. It's a case of what the policy wonks call imperial overstretch, and you're in it. His understanding with the Russians is already fraying at the seams for a whole number of reasons. And not his first thought when his son's born, but his second thought. And I think, personally, is one of the things that propels him into war with Russia, is he thinks, I am not a well man. He's not well. I'm showing a lot of the symptoms of the same thing that killed my father and killed my uncle. And I'm not feeling good. And he's only a little boy. Anything happens to me will be a long regency. And regencies are not good for a country. Regencies always lead to instability. What looks like the solution, the son being born, on second thoughts, when he factors in his own health, seems to be, look, we've got a different kind of problem here. How do we handle this? We've got to deal with all the threats to him. He says to two people, Colincourt, his sometime foreign minister and ambassador to Russia, and Cambacérès, who's his right-hand man, really, his consigliere, if you like, the Grand Chamberlain, Minister of Justice, and the senior lawyer of the empire, really. And Napoleon says to both of them, I have got to deal with all the problems while I can still get in the saddle. And I'm glad, really, in many ways, that I wrote that book when I was getting a bit older myself. And I've had the kind of health issues that a fellow my age sometimes does. And I thought, that's exactly how I would feel if I had what he had. Because, he when things start to go wrong with Russia, as they do pretty soon, all right, we've got to try and deal with this definitively. This is the one power left in Europe who could knock us over. I've got to sort this out while I still can. Otherwise, my wife, the Empress, Marie-Louise, will be the regent, and her Regency Council, whoever that's going to be, and my son are going to be faced with a huge problem, and it's called the Russian army. He's not underestimating anybody.
And you mentioned the Continental blockade, and that became a major source of contention with Russia at some point. What was the origin of Napoleon's grudge against Britain? And for that matter, as you've pointed out in other material that you've written, Napoleon wasn't alone in his dislike for the British.
This goes back 150 years from the period we're talking about. This is something he inherits. It's the Anglo-French rivalry. Really the French have already lost the maritime battle. The British control the Atlantic. The French have been pretty much kicked out of most of their empire. In North America, the British have won that round. Britain has shown that for a long time, though, that she could wield tremendous economic and financial power in Europe. This has gone on throughout the 18th century. And this will go on after Napoleon for a while. If you want to get yourself overthrown as a French ruler. Make a trade treaty with England. Try and be friendly to them, because the French sort of manufacturing industry and the French commercial sector, to say nothing of the overseas merchants, such as they are after the loss of America, all hate the British. They hate the British competition. They can't keep up with the British Industrial Revolution. In a way, they don't want to, because they don't want the social dislocation that goes with it. You start cozying up to the British and you've got a problem. Louis XVI and his ministers start talking about a trade deal with Britain just before the revolution. Is cast up at him during the revolution. You don't do it. You just don't do it. And several of Napoleon's successors will fall foul of the same attitude. It's unfair competition. It's also, there's this sense that actually, when you look at the record, it isn't quite true. That the British are always financing foreign coalitions against the French. They bankroll the Prussians and the Austrians. They bankroll the Russians. All of those rulers would say, oh yeah, chance would be a fine thing. They promise the earth and they never deliver, perfidious Albion. But that's the feeling that's there. You know, the British have so much money that, okay, they can't fight their own wars, but they can pay anybody else to do them. And so it's irreducible. Napoleon himself is beginning to see that the British alone are irreducible, but they can be isolated. He's knocked out the Austrians, he's knocked out the Russians. He's come to an understanding with the Russians. If that breaks down, he's got to then knock out the Russians. That will leave the British with no real allies. You know, they can make trouble in Spain, but Spain isn't a launch pad that's going to bring him down. But you know, this problem with Britain isn't to do with Napoleon. He's inherited it, and it's a show that's going to run and run.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about Napoleon's relationship with Tsar Alexander? Did his feelings towards Alexander override common sense when it came to making such life and death decisions about invading Russia?
I think he didn't always get Alexander right, but who could? It's a fascinating thing, their relationship. They're two absolutely fascinating men, very different from each other. Both of them very bright. Napoleon does sometimes underestimate Alexander. I think he sees him as young, as a bit too young for the job, as someone who can be easily bullied. A lot of people thought that about Alexander. You know, he'll do what the person who shouted at him told him to do. But Alexander, to those who knew him, well, those who were familiar with him, always admitted that he was unknowable. His nickname was the Sphinx of the North, because he had come through a world that makes Game of Thrones look like Sesame Street. Think about it. Not one Russian Tsar between Alexander going right back 100 years to Peter the Great had died peacefully in his bed. Now the Tsarinas, wow. You know, they go on. Catherine the Great and her three predecessors, Elizabeth, Anne, and Catherine the First, they do have fairly long, successful reigns. But the men basically all die in either mysterious circumstances or circumstances that are anything but mysterious. You throw a window, you get throat cut. Indeed, Alexander may have been complicit in his own father's murder. So he has to navigate a world that is very, very dangerous. You know, there's a story told by Alexander later on and by other people, so I think it's probably true, that when they meet at Tilsit in 1807, this is the big summit diplomacy between them to sort things out. They do the kind of macho thing and inspect each other's imperial guards. And afterwards, Napoleon says, see those fellas? Every single one of them has been a soldier in my army for years. I promoted them all on merit. They're all my men. I brought them on. They're loyal to me. And Alexander says, you see that lot? I inherited them. It's hereditary, those regiments. Those regiments killed my father.
Mm.
Killed my grandfather. They could kill me. There's the difference. I don't think Napoleon ever quite took that in. Alexander has to appear a yes man sometimes if he wants to survive. But the other thing Napoleon doesn't get, and I don't terribly blame him for it, because this is something that kind of comes over Alexander in the course of the War of 1812 and the French invasion, is that, Napoleon's a very secular-minded man. I mean, he believes in something. He always says, I believe in something, but I don't know what it is. But, when you've been a soldier, you've got to believe in something better than all this. Well, I'm not an atheist, but, I'm not a churchgoer. I'm not, and he's not. I mean, he's very much a rationalist of his time. They say, as was Jefferson, as were most of them. Alexander increasingly becomes a man of faith. Alexander develops a very strong sense of God, of faith, the church, and just that sort of inner strength that keeps him going, that says, no matter what compromises I have to make, no matter all the arguments and twists and turns, I believe that Russia will survive and Russia will win. And I don't think Napoleon understands that. Napoleon takes Moscow partly because he has to provision his troops, but also as a way of saying, right, this is the gauntlet thrown down now. You've got to do something. You can't have me sitting occupying Moscow, especially after your lieutenants have burned it down. And Alexander's initial reaction to Napoleon's seizure of Moscow is horror. And when he hears it's been burnt down, he's horrified. And yet he pulls himself together. Says, okay, boys, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Let's just let him sit there until it gets cold. Everybody be patient. Everybody just be patient. We'll get him in the end. And this carries Alexander all the way to Paris. We never give up. But sometimes you've got to take the detour. But we'll get there. I mean, Alexander can go nuts sometimes. He can come off with some crazy things. But Napoleon doesn't really see that. I mean, Ridley Scott got it in the film when we were, I thought it was one of the best parts of the film when Napoleon comes into the Kremlin and it's empty. Napoleon sort of saying, come out, little boy, come on, come out and fight. And thinks, well, yeah, I've got him now. He's not up to it. He likes Alexander, but he doesn't think he's up to it. And Alexander is in his own way, which is a very different way to Napoleon's. Very different, man.
Well, that part of the story, that part of the invasion, that brings me to this other aspect that I was hoping to ask you about. So I have this rather lengthy prologue to this next question. So if you could please bear with me. The Russian invasion is a disaster for Napoleon and to some extent for Alexander, although that was part of his strategy. But that strategy, it included the destruction of the Russian countryside and the virtual destruction of Moscow. And so you have this aspect of the climate of war in Europe during that era, and hundreds of years previously as well. You have all these detailed descriptions of the many battles fought between the French and other European kingdoms and states and so on. Two things struck me. First of all, the amount of human slaughter and the destruction of the European landscape. And secondly, the amount of chaos that seemed to be caused by this lack of communication in the military ranks during battle, including Napoleon and Alexander. So I went back to review Tolstoy's War and Peace, which I read several years ago, and it covers basically the same time period. Tolstoy made it very clear he was not impressed with elevating leaders like Napoleon and Alexander and others as these brilliant military strategist. It seems Tolstoy's contention that decisions were made on the fly, that most leaders on the battlefields didn't even know what was really happening most of the time. So to quote Tolstoy, it was not Napoleon who directed the course of the battle, for none of his orders were executed, and during the battle, he did not know what was going on before him. So the way in which these people killed one another was not decided by Napoleon's will, but occurred independently of him, in accord with the will of hundreds of thousands of people who took part in the common action. It only seemed to Napoleon that it all took place by his will. So what is your view of Tolstoy's supposition?
Well, Alexander himself, to start with Alexander briefly, knew pretty quickly in his career that he was not a military man, and left the fighting really to his generals. He'd interfere occasionally, but not that often. When it comes to the overall strategy, planning the campaign, laying out the objectives, I think Tolstoy was wrong. I think most commanders at the time, I think it was in an era in many ways that was blessed, very much in inverted commas, blessed with very good military commanders. Napoleon was surrounded, lucky to be surrounded by many good field commanders until about 1812 in Russia, various reasons. Some of his best men weren't there. Alexander had good commanders too. But there is a maxim, I think, not a maxim, there's an expression, all battle plans collapse on first contact.
Mm-hmm.
You know, lay it all out, but then it starts and stuff happens. Well, one of the things we've got to remember about these battles that they were fought with muskets, they were fought with ball and muskets, cannonballs and gunpowders going off everywhere. It's often just extremely difficult to see anything at all. The fog. The weather kicks in, it can start to rain, it could be a foggy morning, it can get dark early, whatever. It can be cloudy. All of that fouls things up, which is actually part of the reason Napoleon develops a corps system that commanders can act independently. You know what your overall objective's got to be, but sometimes you've got to use your own initiative to achieve it. The point is to keep in touch with me. Too often they fail to do that, especially in Russia, where communications are vaster, very difficult. Infrastructure is non-existent in many places. He's not used to that. They're not used to that. They make a mess of it. Again, coming back to his health, say at Borodino, at Smolensk, the battle that precedes Borodino, he's well. He's on the ball. He's okay. Things go pretty well. But Borodino, now Napoleon at least is in what he hopes is a good vantage point. It's not really. He thinks it is. He thinks he can't see a lot of things. He doesn't know they're going on, and no one's telling him what's going on for long periods. But he doesn't move from it. He's starting to feel unwell. Usually at certain points in critical battles, Napoleon will leave his HQ, his headquarters, and briefly go to where he thinks he sees trouble, assess it for himself, boost morale, do all that, but assess the situation. All right, this is what you need. This is what I think you're up against. He doesn't do that at Borodino. I mean, on the other side, you get the same thing. Kutuzov, the Russian commander, he doesn't even go to the battlefront. He spends the whole time in his tent, never leaves it. Napoleon thinks he knows what he's doing because he thinks he can see, but he can't. And he won't be convinced. Kutuzov doesn't know. It's only in desperation that some of his other commanders, chiefly Barclay de Tolly, literally kick his door in and say, look, you have got to start a withdrawal or we're all going to die. So in that sense, Tolstoy is quite right. He is quite right. But it's not as simple as that. And it's not a universal norm, but it was certainly true of Borodino.
How were Napoleon and these other leaders able to constantly restock their armies? I mean, of course, these leaders employed some brutal conscription methods, but how could the populations of those various nations continually supply the tens and hundreds of thousands of needed troops?
Well, there were varying degrees of success at different methods. France and Russia are by far the two most populous countries in Europe. And France, don't forget at that time, France is also the empire. Belgium, Holland, most of Italy, Western Germany, they're all under French control. Control all of them. Alexander has a surefire conscription system, and it's called serfdom. He tells his nobles, the great serf owners, you owe me per estate so many conscripts, go and get them. And they can. They tell the heads of the villages, you supply them. And they do. It's surefire. That's one of the reasons that in the end, nobody ever abolished serfdom. Because you could just pull an army up from nowhere. It takes a long time to assemble, a long time to train. But by the time we get to 1812, from about 1806-7 onwards, the Russians have been working on that. They can get them from their rural areas to depots. Take some time, but the depots are there. Increasingly, the equipment is there for them. Good officers, good NCOs, and they train them. It takes a while, but they do it. The French don't have serfdom. They barely had it at all since the Middle Ages, and what was there was abolished by the Revolution. They develop an incredibly complex and sophisticated form of conscription. Far more sophisticated and flexible than the American draft that was used in Vietnam, but also fiendish. Because they introduced during the Revolution what they call the état civil, which is basically making the records of birth, deaths, and marriages public and having to be registered by mayors, in every town, every rural area. They now know the population. So they will assign a conscription quota to every department, which is the basic unit of administration of the empire, about the size of the county across the empire. Your population of young men is this, so your quota is that. And then they call them up 3, sometimes 4 times a year. And they call them in, you draw the numbers, your number comes up. They take what they need. But they only take that quota for that year. This is where it's fiendish. They always leave a few behind so that they can come back and get you if they need you. So it's very different, say, from the American draft or the draft that we used in Britain in the 2 world wars. If your number doesn't come up that year, you're safe. But with the French system, the Napoleonic system, you're not safe. They can always come back for you. They use it again in World War I. And that's how they can go on getting them. Now, by the end, they're all breaking their own rules. They're taking married men. They're taking boys of 16. They're breaking all the rules there are. But they've got pools and pools of veterans that they can draw on if they absolutely need to. The peasants call it the blood tax. That's how they do it. The Prussians develop a different system. And their army is always the smallest, but arguably the best. Because they developed a system after 1806 when Napoleon has stumped them well and truly. That they have as large a professional army as Napoleon will let them have. Behind that, they have the Landwehr, which is a reserve. And they get around it by taking peasants, again, because there's serfdom in Prussia, taking them in, training them, keeping them for 3 or 4 months of the year, letting them go home, bringing them back. And in the meantime, there's another batch who comes in to replace them. So that by the time you get to about 1813, there's a fairly strong, flexible army built up for a country of that size. It has to be said, the Austrians never really crack it. After 1809 in Wagram, the Austrian army is a shadow of its former self. Napoleon makes sure that it can't rise again. They cannot impose anything on the Hungarian side of the monarchy. They have to wait on their goodwill whether they supply troops or not. The Austrian side of the monarchy, again, they tend to rely on professional troops. It's harder for them. And they are, despite the fact that they're a larger population, a larger state than Prussia, they are a least important military power of all the major ones. But they all handle it in very different ways. The British, again, do not use conscription. There are a lot of volunteer units. There are local yeomanry units. Some of them are mobilized, professionalized, trained. It's a small army. By the time it comes out of the Peninsular War, it's a very professional, well-trained army. But it is small. Russians have to really shoulder the load. The Prussians actually do most of the fighting, but the Russians are always there as the backup. But Napoleon can go on, although he's scraping the bottom of the barrel, he can go on putting men in the field for a very long time. By the time you get to Waterloo, the 1815 campaign, by hook and by crook, he fields about 200,000 men altogether. And it's using all sorts of bending the rules when it comes to conscription. And it's very complicated, but he manages to do it. But they are all he has by then. Alexander has roughly the same number of men already in France and plenty more in the depots on the way. That's all Napoleon has at Waterloo. There's precious little else. Certainly not enough to take them on. Again, that's the time.
Well, the full timeline of Napoleon, his rise, his influence, and his fall is so enormous that I don't think we can do justice, as I mentioned earlier, to all these different aspects. But a question I would like to put to you about this cinematic attempt by Ridley Scott. One of the film critics maintained that the movie was as much about Napoleon's rocky relationship with Josephine as it was about European politics and military strategy. So with this recent release of all the personal correspondence that you had access to, which gives us a more rounded profile of Napoleon, would a comment about the film focusing on Napoleon's personal relationships then be more relevant?
No. It focuses on both. It focuses on both, Ernest. Scott is a great storyteller, so he picked on the two parts of the life that really will make good cinema. His take on the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine was very interesting. I think in its conception, it was about as accurate as you can get. Speaking as an historian, I think trying to trace these things, these personal relationship things, they're very difficult, no matter how much information you have. Napoleon wrote a lot to Josephine. A lot of it we've got, some of it disappeared. He unhelpfully burnt, after the divorce, all her letters to him. Now, she wasn't a great correspondent, but even so, so it makes it very difficult to get at. I think the film was right to concentrate a lot on it because it was the single most important thing in his personal life. He did say several times, and he said it on paper, so he didn't lie, I really liked Marie-Louise, his second wife. I really liked her. I respected her. But I love Josephine, and there's a difference. And I think I think the film brought out very well, although I think it went over the top. Sometimes it's a Ridley Scott film, so it went over the top. It bring out the passion on his part, and it also brought out the insecurity when it came to Josephine. He wasn't insecure about anything else, but he was when it came to her, and people remarked on it. What is it with her? He's not the usual sort of rational, in control sort of person he always is, but he was that way about her. The letters are very passionate. The remarks you get are very passionate. The divorce was the hardest thing he ever did. I think it's the only time he behaved like a genuine coward. You know, when he turned around and he said to Josephine's son, Eugene, who was his adopted son, he said, look, at one point he actually does say to her, this is true, I think. Look, could you tell her when you see that I'd do anything for you? I'll stand by you in all of this. I'll stand by you. You know, you sent me to rule Italy. It's a tough call. You know, I'll go and fight the Russians for you. If you tell me to go into exile after you divorce my mom, I'll go. But no, mate, I'm not doing that. You do that for Oh, come on. Who brought you up? You know, no, I still won't do it. You know, so, oh, right, you know. It brought that out of it. You know, I'm kind of sorry the film didn't go into that too much. Josephine is a Josephine in the film. I thought Vanessa was great as the part was written. I thought she got certain aspects of Josephine's character really well. The calmness in social and political situations, the ability to handle yourself, the ability to handle Napoleon. Josephine for these times, in the thing that's played down a little bit, it comes out more in the director's cut. So Josephine was living in a man's world. She was widowed in the revolution. Her family in the Caribbean had been massacred in the slave revolt. She had nothing except herself. And she survived by finding the coming man and making sure he was attracted to her and knowing when to move on. They caught that at the end when she basically throws herself at Alexander, which she did. You know, this is the new man. This is what I have to do. But she wasn't quite the independent lady the film portrays. But they got an awful lot of the relationship between the two right.
Mm-hmm.
It really did.
You know, in your acknowledgements in Decline and Fall, you explain that this third biographical volume grew out of the Project Napoleonic Civilization, a project that you initiated through the Leverhulme Trust. And significantly, you also point out that Volume 3 as well as Volume 2, Soldier of Destiny, were really greatly enhanced with the newly available personal correspondence of Napoleon, which was released by the Foundation Napoleon based in Paris. And you stated that this material will revolutionize Napoleonic studies for generations to come. So why is this new material so important?
Well, this is a long story in some ways, but a lot of the stuff is very important. Until now, the version of the Napoleon's official correspondence we had was edited and put together by his nephew, Napoleon III.
Oh.
So controlled. You know, it's as if Teddy Kennedy had controlled John Kennedy's papers. You know, you only see so much. And it's very interesting, some of the stuff that's never appeared before, the Fondation was able to get hold of in a different era, is family related.
Mm-hmm.
An awful lot they wanted buried, obviously. And a lot of this can have a big political impact on high politics. The Fondation was able to do that. It's 3.5 getting on for 4 times longer than the original compilation. They were able to get, because of modern research methods and things, they were able to get into places that the original team, which is in the mid-19th century, the 1850s and 60s, simply weren't able to do. And it's not just the personal stuff that's important. They were able to go through state papers to an extent that they couldn't before. For many years, he was, probably until Hitler, the most famous person in the world. And people would buy a letter by Napoleon simply for the signature because it was worth a lot of money. J.P. Morgan was one such. And he bought, somehow or other, an official letter from Napoleon to Talleyrand. For example, I'll pick one big example out. In 1805, just before the war starts again, when Napoleon is on the Channel camps thinking about invading England, and suddenly the Austrians and the Russians decide to invade him. So he has to turn around and head south with his army very fast. There's a letter to Talleyrand lambasting him and saying, look, do you realize this has all happened fast and that nobody told me about it? Nobody seems to know anything about what. Now, I've had to go south with the whole army to face these guys. I don't know how many of them there are. There is nothing but a few National Guard units between you and the Channel coast. Nothing to stop the English walking to Paris. If we lose this, we lose everything. So you hold on to your hat. And I'm telling you something. We should have had intelligence in the Netherlands to tell us what was going on. You should have had intelligence in the Netherlands to what's going on. You're in trouble. And when this finishes, if we're still in one piece, we are going to change the way the Netherlands is governed. And he does. Everyone has always assumed that he deposes the Dutch leadership and brings in his brother in a wave of optimism, hubris, power. Nothing of the kind. He does it because he's scared. This is not a confident man. That letter shows us. This is someone who is really worried, really been taken by surprise. We didn't know that. I think it's rather important we do. There's an awful lot of other stuff that you can flesh out things that you thought were probably true. Well, now as an historian, you can say they are because you've got written evidence, whereas before you just had rumor, unreliable memoirs and stuff like that. Now you've got the real thing. It impacts the field in a whole number of ways, and it's indispensable. It's going to change everything. It really is.
Now, also in the acknowledgements, you say there's a wider project still in progress with more to come in the years ahead. Anything we can expect that you can release?
Well, not for a bit. I hope so. I was working on it this morning, actually. I was working on it just before the Zoom call came through. Yeah, I think there might be, with a bit of luck, don't tempt fate, maybe a couple more volumes on that theme of Napoleonic civilization. I'm very interested in doing something on the Napoleonic legal codes and their impact on Europe and on the empire. But I have to say, there's a very bright young French scholar whose thesis I revived a few years ago, who's, I think, making me redundant and galloping at my heels. But there may still be, there are still things to do, I think. There's still aspects of the project, I think, that I would like to, I'm still working on some pieces. Everything comes back.
Well, Michael, we so appreciate your taking time to talk to us and providing insight into this iconic character of history. We thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
And, we wish you the best in your future projects.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. And when you do log on to the website, don't forget to register to access the Outrageous History Members Lounge, where you'll find all sorts of additional information in the podcast deep dives and the authors' deep dives. You'll have to register to access the lounge, but it's free and easy to do. So thanks for tuning in to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.